To prepare myself for Ace Combat 7, I was perusing the wiki and came across something pretty interesting. The world map for Ace Combat has something a little familiar. Yep, it's just straight up New Zealand hanging out over by Antarctica. This is pretty weird. The countries in Ace Combat are based on the real world, but geographically it's completely different. But here's New Zealand just there. It's not even in the right place, it's just in the middle of the map above Antarctica. So it got me thinking, how is New Zealand used in other games? Now, we aren't proud to admit it, but New Zealanders get pretty excited whenever we're mentioned. We're ignored so often, left off so many maps, that if someone says the words New and Zealand in the same sentence, we piss ourselves, we're so excited. About 5 years ago when I played Metal Gear Rising for the first time and Raiden said this,
"They're in New Zealand."
I got fucking hyped. It was the hypest moment in the whole game for me, which is saying a lot for Metal Gear Rising. So yeah, I got exploring and found some pretty interesting examples. The first thing that popped into my head was Hitman 2. It made some headlines a couple months ago because it had a level in Hawke's Bay. I was excited to see what they'd do with a New Zealand setting. This is Hitman we're talking about. Some of the most legendary and open-ended level designs in the biz. What kind of disguises could I wear? What kind of crazy weapons could I use? Maybe like a jandal? Or like a native tree? So did Hitman's take on the old Hawke's Bay live up to my expectations? No. It's a tutorial level, so it's tiny. One house on a beach. None of the characters are from New Zealand either, but I was determined to get up to some Kiwi mischief, so I got to work. I managed to find a moldy paddle. As far as I know, that's the only NZ specific weapon here. It's pretty funny though. Hitman 2 also features the most pitiful attempt at a New Zealand accent I have ever seen.
Kia ora, Ari from Kiwi Repair here.
Uh-oh, looks like somebody watched this video with the audio out of sync, because that would make it so it sounds like that Brett McKenzie's talking in Kermit's voice, and Kermit is speaking in Brett McKenzie's voice, and maybe they thought that like New Zealanders sound like Kermit. This guy sounds like Kermit is the point of that joke. I'm pretty disappointed in this level, but hey, at least you get to explore a nice New Zealand beach. Oh wait, never mind. Another game that made some headlines, well, it's not technically a game, but the latest Civ VI expansion, Gathering Storm, has the Modi in it, with Coupe as their leader. Besides just being awesome conceptually, they seem like they're gonna be a really good civilization. They start on the ocean, which is neat as hell, and instead of an amphitheater, they get a marae. The expansion isn't out yet, but it's very close, and this looks like a really great representation of Māori culture. They actually did their research, down to the tattoos, so this one's looking good. Street Fighter V has a stage in New Zealand. Not much to say about this one, honestly. It's in the Southern Alps. There's sheep. Some pukeko, other native birds, you get the idea. It's a cool stage and a pretty generous representation if you ask me, but it's a fighting game so there's not much else going on here besides how it looks. You can't really talk about New Zealand in games without mentioning Far Cry 3. This game was hyped up for me when it came out because it has Modi in it. So basically what Ubisoft did with Far Cry 3 was like, they just kind of grabbed a bunch of stuff from different cultures and smushed them together. And one of those cultures was Māori. Actually, Māori is one of the more prolific cultural influences on this game because a lot of the NPCs have accents and speak some lines in te reo.
That's not bad.
When I was trying to capture footage for this, I realized that they speak te reo a lot less than I remember. I managed to get this one girl to say kia ora once.
Kia ora.
And the shopkeeper lady says ka kite when you leave.
Ka kite.
But that was kind of all I got. They also don't really acknowledge that it's Māori, so it gives me weird vibes. Honestly, it kind of feels like they chose Māori because not many people would recognize it. A lot of this game kind of reeks of appropriation, and I'm not going to get into all the white savior stuff, but yeah, Far Cry 3 has some problems. Not a big fan of this one, let's move on. Terranigma is a pretty weird one, but it's one of my favorite examples. So Terranigma is a Super Nintendo game which was never released in North America, but it did come out in Europe and Australia. I'm assuming that means it came out in New Zealand as well, because that's usually what that means. But at a certain point in this game, you get a boat and can explore the world. Only the world in Terranigma is like the actual real life Earth, with real countries and stuff to explore. One of those countries is New Zealand, and it's completely empty. But I don't hate this. It's just used as one of those areas where you can get some items and that's it. There's nothing really going on here, but isn't that kinda neat? The South Island just has this weird, barren, crusty little zone to run around in just because. No NPCs or anything, so there's nothing to talk about besides that. I just think it's pretty cool. Another older one is Contra. Now you may be thinking, Felix, Contra was set in the Amazon. And yes, the American version of Contra's manual says it's set in the Amazon, but the Japanese version of the manual mentions a made-up setting called the Galuga Archipelago, which they say is just off the coast of New Zealand. Back in the 80s, nobody gave two shits about game stories, so they just completely changed things in localization. But let the record show that Contra is set by New Zealand, and that's canon. Hey, do you guys remember the sniper from TF2? That's right, the Australian dude. Haha, just kidding! He's from New Zealand, dumbass. Back in 2014, Valve released a comic called Blood in the Water, which revealed some interesting things about the sniper's backstory. It turns out that his parents weren't actually his biological parents, and that, in reality, he was born in the lost underwater nation of New Zealand. In TF2's version of the world, New Zealand went missing several decades ago. The sniper's dad is actually the reason why. He convinced everyone to move underwater to avoid some sort of horrible tragedy. The sniper ended up in Australia by crawling into a rocket ship as a baby and accidentally blowing a hole in the dome surrounding New Zealand, killing everyone. There's this running gag in New Zealand about how we keep getting left off maps. We have a whole subreddit dedicated to it. So it's pretty funny that in TF2, New Zealand literally disappeared from the map. I'm a big fan of this one, even though everyone died. Somebody on the New Zealand subreddit pointed me towards Syndicate Wars, the sequel to the isometric tactics game Syndicate, which happens to have a level set in Christchurch. It's set in the distant future, so the architecture has zero resemblance to how Christchurch actually looks. I don't live in Christchurch, so I can't tell if the layout or anything like that is realistic, but I'm gonna assume that this level has very little to do with the real world city it's based on. It's still a pretty interesting and obscure inclusion though. New Zealand is also mentioned in a data point in Horizon Zero Dawn. It talks about how New Zealand was submerged, I'm noticing a trend here, and then rebuilt decades later. The current Prime Minister implemented this program to give tax incentives to New Zealanders returning home after the submergence. Not much else is said beyond that, but I think it's this really interesting slice of what was going on in New Zealand within Horizon's lore. The NewZealand Story was an arcade game created by Taito, which is actually the same company that made Space Invaders. How's that for pedigree? NewZealand Story has since been ported to multiple consoles, most notably the NES and Nintendo DS. I tried playing the DS version and found the touchscreen stuff pretty annoying, so you're gonna be watching the NES version here. You play as what they claim is a Kiwi chick, but it looks nothing like one, and you go through levels set in major cities and towns. The first levels are in Auckland, which is pretty generous of them since that's where I live, so I'm actually kinda qualified to talk about it. These levels are set in Auckland Zoo specifically. I went to the zoo recently, so this should all be pretty familiar. You can probably guess by looking at this game right now, but this is not what Auckland Zoo looks like. There aren't really any good references to New Zealand specific stuff here, besides this very un-Kiwi-like Kiwi and the map screen. You fight a giant flying pink whale at the end of the Auckland stages though, so that's cool. Wish they had those at the real zoo. I played a little bit of the next world, which is based on Rotorua, and things look generally more promising, but the link to New Zealand is still tenuous at best. This game was apparently inspired by a holiday to New Zealand by one of the programmers, and if not accurate, this game seems to admire New Zealand quite a bit. This is also like a pretty good game, especially for the NES. I enjoyed the New Zealand Story. That's a thumbs up from me. And of course, I've saved the best for last. There was one game I kept hearing about when I was researching for this video, a game that's apparently so beloved and so influential that I have never heard of it. I am of course talking about Jonah Lomu Rugby, baby. What an absolute legend. Everywhere I looked, this game popped up with someone saying Jonah Lomu Rugby is the best sports game ever made. This game has a legacy and I'd never heard of it until now. To be fair, I don't play any sports games, and it came out 3 years before I was born, so that's probably why. I actually found a preview for this game in a Sega Saturn magazine from 1997. Here they say, with so many levels of detail, Jonah Lomu Rugby could easily have surfaced as a complicated sports title only accessible to hardcore fans. Fortunately, Rage and Codemasters have taken the time and effort to please both newcomers and experienced rugby players alike by producing a fast-paced, intuitive title that easily ranks amongst the finest sports games ever seen on Saturn. So that's Codemasters 1, EA 0. I can't believe we were still burning EA 20 years ago. Jonah Lomu was a legend. He was 19 when he played his first international game. I'm gonna be 19 in like 2 weeks. The man was a beast. It seems fitting that such a legend gave birth to such a legendary game. New Zealand is a very unique setting in games. There's a different interpretation just about every time, which is honestly something I'm kind of proud of. Each of these games has this very interesting take on New Zealand, and while it's a shame that a lot of those takes are inaccurate or bordering on offensive, you can see this trend towards better representation for our little country, and that makes me quite excited for what's to come. Thanks for watching my video. I really enjoyed working on this one. I want to give a huge shout out to the r/NewZealand subreddit community who gave me heaps of tips about games to look at. If you want to see more videos like this, then you should subscribe and watch some of my other videos if you haven't already. Also, leaving a like really boosts my self-esteem, and it helps the channel too, I guess. Thanks.